Hello, everyone. My name is Mark, and welcome to my podcast where we talk nothing but news you may or may not have. News. In today's news, Oxford's word of the year deservingly went to, ironically, the two words rage bait. Oxford defines it as online media created to stir up outrage, but in reality, rage bait shows up everywhere. When the Guadalupe Wingstop finally realizes they didn't print your ticket after an hour and a half, when your mother's still talking under her breath about an argument that ended 10 minutes ago, or even in 1943's headlines, where Zoot-Suiters walked the streets sharply dressed while servicemen were in uniform preparing for an invasion any day of the week. Of course, the Zoot-Suit riots were more than just rage bait directed at sailors by Mexican Americans. They were layered with problems built up over generations, but to start off, let's touch on what I mentioned before. Luis Alvarez, author of The Power of the Zoot, explains that when zoot suits became a trend among Mexican American youth, World War II was escalating. Citizens feared a Japanese invasion, and it seemed like the West Coast, especially Los Angeles, was the most likely target. And while this was possibly the worst news someone could ever receive, many Angelinos felt a strange pride at being that important. Now imagine you're in the military, running drills, working your butt off, and being told to prepare for a war any day now. It's not hard to see how watching others dress fashionably and impressing the ladies could make you angry. Many servicemen also saw the lower rates of Mexican American enlistment as proof they didn't belong in the country, some even viewing them as leeches who wouldn't even defend the place they lived in. And then there was rationing. War demands resources, and wool was no exception. Every thread mattered, for uniforms and blankets going overseas. So sailors would look at the zoot suits, these long, wide, oversized, flashy outfits, and say, hey, these guys are wasting precious wool that we could be using way more efficiently. So not only were Mexican Americans leeching off the land, quote unquote, they were also using up the resources that the country couldn't afford to lose to fancy suits. This resentment and anger eventually exploded into the Zoot Suit riots, widely reported by the Los Angeles Times. One story described a single Monday night when more than 50 zoot-suited youths were beaten and stripped of their clothing. Zoot-suiters retaliated too. Another article mentioned a 20-year-old sailor who had been knifed by a gang of youths. And of course, the papers labeled the zoot-suiters as a gang, not the sailors who were also roaming the city, assaulting people. And this leads us to life for Mexican Americans nearly a century earlier. Alvarez also writes about how the Navy displaced many Mexican American working families to build an armory and training base, something that would understandably make people less willing to support or join the Navy in the first place. But even that was just another chapter in a longer pattern. After the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, many Mexicans were given the option to stay. Some left, but those who stayed soon learned that Americans moving in did not play nice. Land was taken from Mexican Americans both through legal and illegal means, and they were often labeled as bandits to justify the injustice. America seems to never change. Back then, people were losing land and being called thugs or villains, and a century later, the same stereotypes persisted. And even though the New York Times reported the mayor of Los Angeles claiming the riots had, quote, no question of racial discrimination, end quote, his real bias showed when he called Mexican Americans youthful gangs. This had always been about race and partially about patriotism. He wanted to reassure the Mexican government that there was no violence towards Mexicans who were complaining about it at the time, but also maintain a face of service and duty during the wartime to seem more powerful to enemies. In the end, we see that the Zoot Suit riots weren't caused simply by the supposedly low enlistment or uncooperation of Mexican Americans. They were fueled by deep-rooted racism that the country had been carrying since 1848. This, of course, doesn't mean Mexican Americans are totally innocent. They were, after all, roaming the streets waiting to fight sailors as well. But we do see the same hardships placed on Mexican Americans from the moment they were annexed. And we also see a fashion trend so beautiful, you have to wonder how we ended up with Edgar cuts. Thank you for tuning into today's episode. Today's topic was a heavy one, especially since it's hard to imagine our relatives trying to enjoy themselves as youth only to be brutalized by men with zero style and a shaved head. Sources referenced in this video will be in the description, and I highly encourage people to look into this topic. It might inspire the next generation for a new fashion trend, or it might enlighten you on problems in today's society. But whatever the case is, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. And remember, baggy clothing was a trend way before 2025. Goodbye.